Here is Monteverde Turtle, a turquoise ink.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
While I stick with this as a turquoise, it could be a very light blue, but I don't think so. Just a blue leading turquoise. There is certain tone variation by paper as it changes, and there is very little shading. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, you need to test this ahead of time to make sure it is going to be the tone that you would like. Turquoise is not really for me generally, and this turquoise absolutely isn't for me.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M800 Stone Garden with a medium nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
We can see that we do have a very pale turquoise on the page. It's not feathering and it's not spreading. It is shading. So we do have to remember that turquoise doesn't always shade a whole lot. Look at remember on the first line. The burr at the end is a bit darker than the rest of the word. The right next to it is nice darker tone, while water next to that starts lighter on the wa, but the tur at the end does get a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer.
Here is Monteverde Blue Black. Here is Monteverde Brown Sugar. Here is Monteverde California Teal. Here is Monteverde Canyon Rust.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
The tone we get here is a little bit lighter and looks a little bit more as a light blue than a turquoise compared to the Clairfontaine. Now, we don't get any kind of feathering, a spread. We get almost nothing for shading. In fact, the only spot I'm seeing that has shading is when day long and they from the first and second line collide, and that's when it gets just a little bit darker. For the most part, this is a flat uniform tone, which is not a bad thing if that's really what you like in your inks. I don't think this is unreadable on the page. It's just not what I would want to read pages and pages of, meaning it really puts itself more as a second color on the page than a primary for me. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
The tone we get on the page here is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, and it doesn't become, it went from a blue-leaning turquoise to a green-leaning turquoise, showing that the ink itself is a little bit more translucent. Not a big deal. Just keep this in mind as the tone of the paper can change what you're getting in your ink. It's not feathering and it's not spreading. It's not shading. It's not hard to read. I think the tone of the paper in this case is really helping it be easier to read than it might have been otherwise. Looking at the back of the page, there's a couple of spots where it got deeper into the page. I'm not even sure how well that's going to come through on camera. I do think with this ink, you could write on the back of the page. It didn't bleed through touching the page underneath, so it stays in a safe zone.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
The tone we're getting here is the same as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It shades just a little bit. I mean, you can see it there on the second line, where the H and the last E are a little bit darker than the T and the ER in the middle. But there is not a lot of shading. For the most part, we're getting a very uniform tone. The problem we have here is this is on the quad rule paper. I don't feel that as a tone, it's standing out against the quad rule in a way that is very helpful to us. So this isn't a good match for me on quad rule. Again, we're going to fall to it could be a good second color, but certainly not a primary color on the page. Perhaps if you're adding something in that, if missed, isn't the end of the world, this could be a good ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ancient Charm number 16, October.
Here is Blackstone Blue Cypress. Here is Caran d'Ache Hypnotic Turquoise. Here is Colorverse Morning Star.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
The tone we get on the page here is slightly lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, and I'm seeing a slight bit towards a green lean over a blue lean here. Very slight shift in its color. Not a big deal, and under different lights, it can even start to look blue again. I've had to move this around. So this is very affected also by the light that you're under. It's not feathering, not spreading, not shading, not standing out against the quad rule. I would really have to have words with a student that was using this, because I don't know how easily they could read back what they had easily. I mean, you could read if you sat and you worked at it on this, but you don't want to spend that kind of time focusing on your words to be able to read them from your lab notebook. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Monteverde Rose Pink. Here is Thornton's Orange. Here is Organic Studios Edgar Allan Poe. Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters number 3.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we have a slightly lighter tone than we had on the Clairfontaine, though it does stay fairly blue leaning. It does feather and it does spread, which are not really a surprise given that this is a wetter pen. There's a couple spots of shading that you might see, like on a river on the first line, the dot of the I, which is misplaced, and the R at the end. But for the most part, we're not shading. Do I think this is a good use on this paper? Not particularly, and that's for me. If I were grading papers or writing my answers, this does not say this is where I've written something. This says skip this, it's not important. Looking at the back of the page, we get a lot of deep ink into the paper. Even though it's light, I think if you wrote on the back of the page with this ink, you would make it even harder to read. So this would not be a good combination. But it didn't touch the page underneath, so that's good.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This wet medium Pelikan M800 gives a pale turquoise that does have a little bit of shading. Now off camera I tried this in a dry medium and it became almost too faint to comfortably read, so not a good choice. Thus, no matter what pen, it needs to be a wet pen, probably in a fine or a medium, to ensure that you keep it easy to read on the page. That's where a little bit more of the issue comes in, is the read back on the page. I mean, on a slightly off-white paper, anything other than a bright white, it gets harder to read. Really not a good thing.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.